So hello again, everyone, and welcome to another session of our patient-oriented research discussions. Today's topic will explore some of the practical elements around partnering with patients in the realm of data analysis and interpretation. For our session today, we're really going to be relying on our co-learning and your interaction with one another to learn from your expertise and experience. But essentially, in terms of how the session will flow today, there'll be about 5 minutes of background, just setting the stage for patient partner involvement in the research process in general, why, and explore some of the barriers as to why we see limited interaction when it comes to analyzing or participating in the analysis and interpretation of data. And then the bulk of our session today will be split into 3 breakout sessions where we will be discussing 3 key topics with the hope that this would stimulate sort of thinking on your end on what practical approaches you can consider incorporating and employing within your own projects. And then lastly, we'll wrap things up with a few key takeaways or considerations that were mentioned in one of the papers we were referencing in the description. And of course, after today's session, I'll reach out again, supply a recording, slide deck, as well as forward on the citations for those references if you wish to go and explore them again later. So in terms of some housekeeping, there's a few quick elements we want to go over before we jump in. And the first is just to mute your microphone when it is not in use, just to cut down on some of the background noise that we may pick up every now and then. Feel free, of course, to enable your camera during the breakout sessions or during our large group discussions if you wanted to interact that way. And of course, if you do prefer to relay input via the chat box, that of course is open to you as well. And then lastly, and most importantly, is have fun and learn from each other's experience and expertise. So I'm very happy to welcome today half a dozen co-facilitators to help drive some of those discussions and get us thinking about some of these topics. We won't go into introducing all of them, but I just want to welcome Linda, Ken, Lena, Lorraine, and Alan, who are going to pair up today and work on our session. So during our breakouts, they will be there to introduce themselves and help direct your discussions. All right. So to get us thinking about today's topic, I just thought it's worthwhile to consider what some of the published literature says about where and how patient partners fit into the research cycle. And so what we have represented here are the findings of one literature review where the percentages depicted refer to the proportion of about 34 patient-oriented research projects that they were exploring, where they had partnered with patients in some way at the various phases. So just generally, we've broken up the various stages into these 3 preparatory, execution, and translation phases. And what they found, generally, what they found was that among these 34 projects, patient partners most commonly occurred during the preparatory phase of a project, where you were soliciting input about research design or questions or exploring what topics you were going to be exploring. And the patient partner participation or engagement was typically more concentrated in these earlier phases of the project. And of particular interest to our discussion today is that during the execution phase, where they found that patient partners were most likely involved in data collection. So these were typically qualitative research studies where patient partners were involved in focus groups or interviews. But more interestingly is that out of those 34 papers, less than a quarter involved patient partners in the data analysis phase of the project. A similar review done by Domet, they were not only looking at where in the research cycle patient engagement occurred, but explore what form this engagement ended up taking. And so they had a bit more of an expansive view. They looked at 142 published works, and similar to the findings that we just saw in the previous slide, patient engagement typically and more commonly was feasible at the beginning of a project and kind of waned off as the project moves through the execution and translation phases. And again, if you look at that data analysis or data collection bar graph, less than 10% of those studies actually involve patient partners in some capacity in these elements of the research project. And interesting, if you do take a look at the paper, the interesting thing that they do explore, I mentioned, is that mechanism of engagement. So whether it's a focus group, a survey, or an interview, what they find, of course, is that these methods of engagement seem to have less of a direct impact on the study in terms of actually contributing to key decision-making phases. So you are seeing, even if you are seeing engagement, you are typically seeing at a very low level or low degree of engagement when you are involving patient partners in this capacity. So with both of these reviews then suggesting that there is a decrease in patient engagement efforts when it comes to data analysis, generally what roadblocks exist that end up impeding this full participation. And although not exclusive, hopefully we'll be able to explore some of that during today's meeting. To account is that professional expertise, patient partners may need more specific and formalized training in order to interpret and analyze data to meaningfully contribute to the process. However, on the flip side, too much of that formalized training when it comes to statistics and data interpretation may end up diluting or professionalize the patient's perspective, and which could ultimately result in losing their unique voice or input into the project or the findings of the work. Thirdly, engaging patient partners in this capacity in this phase of research can be expensive and time consuming if it is to be done right. So again, that touches on the effort, the considerable time and resources that have to be invested to create more lay accessible results, very accessible findings, having those training resources available. So preparing for the equitable engagement of patient partners, it does end up costing you a lot in time and resources. And lastly, due to some of the inherent power imbalance between the researcher and the patient partner, perhaps coupled with the perceived expertise that researchers have when it comes to data analysis, patient partners may feel out of place or uncomfortable when it comes to challenging the view of the researcher or of the data or the interpretation of the findings. So I realized that was a rather quick and broad overview of some of the elements of patient engagement when it comes to data analysis and some of the factors that may inhibit the full inclusion of partners in that specific capacity. Now, before we sort of rush into our discussion questions, we wanted to take a bit of a poll of our audience here today and to get a sense of sort of where you are. So we will activate a quick yes or no poll, and essentially the question is just asking you whether you or a patient partner being involved in a project where you have seen meaningful engagement of patient partners in the data analysis or interpretation of findings phase of a project. So we'll keep it open for about 15 more seconds, and then we'll see where things are. Then, right, so I'll end the poll there and share the results with you all real quick. So as you can see, so I think the results are sharing, right? It's not showing up on my backup screen. If it's not showing up on your end, I should take my word for it that 48% of you said yes, you have been engaged in a project where that has been done meaningfully and authentically, but just a slight margin of 52% saying no, we have not done so. With that, Tanner, we'll go with the first option. The second option. Sorry, this is the first option. Yes, for our first breakout room. And so, if you want to get our groups set up, and then we will break out. And our first question, before we get started, on whether engaging patient partners in data analysis, interpretation, or findings are worth doing and doable. So again, welcome back, everyone. And I think perhaps for the next two sessions, we'll increase the time a bit more so we can delve into the topics a bit more. But yeah, so I just wanted to welcome you all back again, and I figure we will spend a few minutes trying to to debrief perhaps some of the topics or themes that were touched on in this pre-breakout session. So I'll open it up to the facilitators, and maybe we'll go to unless Kent, I guess we can start with breakout room number 1. Was there any general impressions you wanted to share?
Yeah, like you said, Pierre, the conversation was just getting cooking when we were kicked back to the Zoom version of Kansas. And we did have some interesting thoughts there about, the differences between data interpretation. Just a general consensus that, data interpretation and analysis of various kinds is definitely worth doing. Doability was more down to the how than the whether or not to do it. And it seemed to depend on not just patients versus everybody else, but everybody else relative to their exposure to data in that particular setting.
All right. So I'm going to kick things over to Lena and Alan. Anything of particular note that cropped up in your brief discussion?
Alan, feel free, and anyone actually in group 2 to chime in. We also spoke a little bit about the parsing out the difference between data analysis and data interpretation. Forgive me, I don't remember who mentioned in terms of if there's, let's say, quantitative data and there's a consultation phase with the statistician, that we could also include the patient partners in that consultation process. I think it was Francine that mentioned that the researchers may not know everything in terms of all the different types of analyses that can be done with data, and that the patient partners or community partners could also be included in that process as well. Seeing something, and that to ask if there are questions about the data, and the researcher or research team may have questions, and the patient partners may have questions. Well, to kind of come together and ask those questions together, and then kind of revisit the data and look at it together as well. Also, there were some points about, telling the patient, asking the patient partners early on, about their capacities to take part or their skills related to data analysis early on. And we went back to looking at the whole research design as a whole, and knowing what questions, I think it was Francine and Carly who were talking about this, is involving them early on, and knowing which questions to ask right at the beginning, and involving the patient partners. That will help in terms of engagement later on, and also with the actual analyses of the data and the findings. If anyone has anything else to add, I'm not sure if I'm catching as well in the sense of the discussion.
I'll just add on to what Lena was saying, if that's okay, because we ran out of time. So we were just starting to get going talking about this, but just when we think about stakeholder engagement and the importance of having engaged partners extremely early on in helping develop research questions, it shouldn't be in this stage of data analysis where you're just bringing up, hey, want to participate and help me figure out how to analyze this data that you contributed. It's more of a conversation at the start of the study of like, thank you so much for participating, and having the participants help you develop the questions that they want answered. So like asking participants early on, what do you want people to know? Or what questions are important to you that we answer? So I think having those conversations and not even necessarily dropping the terminology of data analysis, but just really thinking about how you're framing your questions very early on in the research study.
And the benefit of early engagement, like you've just described there, Carly, I think also is that when you get to what we have called the analysis and interpretation phases, whoever your people are, whether they're patients or whatever, interdisciplinary stakeholders you have, when those people have been involved from the beginning in developing the research questions and in gathering the data, then the interpretation and analysis will suggest itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Yeah, and then so lastly, group 3. So Linda and Lorraine, anything else you wish to add that was brought up in your session?
Lorraine, would you like me to start? And you can chime in. So we talked a little bit more about the challenges. We all agree that involving patient and families and stakeholders are important, but rather there are challenges specifically around the study methodology. So we discussed how, especially with quantitative analysis, statistics, different statistical analyses can be difficult, especially if they're more complex to involve patient partners, and they may not have the training for that. First, that could be had with accessing the data required for data analysis. So we discussed about, for example, accessing the data at the administrative level, and how patient partners may be required to go through ethics training. So in that case, how would you involve patient partners? And we discussed about start to delve into potential recommendations, but we didn't get quite into it. And about how maybe patient partners can be involved in the interpretation of findings, or whether it's, do they need to access the specific data, or whether it could be looking at from a more general approach. And how do we accurately capture and translate what patient partners are telling us? I'm happy to, if anyone from group 3 wants to chime in, or Lorraine, you want to add on.
Yeah, I guess I interpreted one of the comments that it might have been beyond just ethics training that patient partners were being asked to undertake, that there were other administrative hoops that they had to jump through to gain access. So I'm just curious about, how we might educate administrators, those involved in research to be able to remove those barriers and provide more streamlined approaches to gaining access to that information. And I don't know if others want to comment. I think we were just starting to get into that when we were pulled back into the big session. So did I interpret that correctly, that it was potentially beyond ethics training, that patients were being required to jump through more hoops than that?
I see Caitlin gave a thumbs up. So yes, that was right. And it was Caitlin who brought that up. And we start to delve with a group discussion around that.
And Caitlin, I might recommend, given that you and Pierre are at the same institution, Pierre might have some thoughts or recommendations around that. So that might be an opportunity to do an offline connection there to see how, what he might be able to, not to put you on the spot, Pierre, but I don't think it's exclusive. My sense was it was not certainly exclusive to UBC. But if there are other recommendations that folks can make in terms of how to support administrators to better understand why it's important for patients to gain access to that data.
Yeah, we can certainly connect, Caitlin. So I'm realizing we are doing a bit better on time. So for the next 2 sessions, we'll increase our discussion time to about 15 minutes. It's still not going to be enough, I know, always when you get started. Yeah, so we will do that, and then I think we'll be able to still wrap up on time today. So thanks all for sharing those great thoughts and getting those conversations started. So before we break out into our next topic, I'll bring it up on the screen, and then again, once we break into the rooms, we will share it in the chat so you have a copy of the question on your end. Following that first question we just covered, we were sort of exploring the utility of whether, or of how doable the involvement of patient partners are at that stage, and sort of what their perspective could generally bring and enhance your interpretation of findings. More practically, next question will explore sort of what the roles of those partners, or of those patient partners and the researchers are on the team. That's something that our discussion group started getting on, but just generally, you are going to try and explore what the complementary roles of both the researchers and the patient partners are on the project, and sort of what skill sets or unique points of view do they bring that can ultimately enhance the outcome of your work. So with that, we'll open the discussion rooms again, and then do our thing and circle back in about 15 minutes and debrief and see where our discussions led us to. All right, I think we have everyone back together again. I don't know, I haven't had any Zoom issues yet, so that's quite abnormal. So far, smooth sailing. So welcome back, everyone. I hope I realize, and even with the extended time, it's never enough to really get to everything you want to discuss. But hopefully, it enables a bit more of a fulsome time in your respective breakout rooms. So I'm screen sharing, perfect. So with that said, let us jump right into some of the thoughts that you had all shared. So maybe I'll start with Linda and Lorraine this round. So yeah, feel free to share what your group were able to discuss and explore.
Sure, I can start us off with a brief summary. Lorraine, you can also chime in right after and open out for our group. So we started off with discussing about the experiences that both patient partners and researchers can bring. We really started off with thinking about how there is a stigma with the term patient, and that is more than just the patient partners and they're bringing in their lived experiences, but they also have other skill sets. With patients that are behind that, they're also human beings. So consider asking them about what other skill sets they have. Whether it's with, for example, someone from our group also brought up that one of our patient partners has the skills in graphic design, and that helped to contribute to the making of materials within this study. Also take into consideration the lived experiences and the diverse representations that they have, for example, geographical locations like rural, suburban, or inner city. Consider the types of patient partners who are your patients. Are they youth, parents? What kind of viewpoints do they bring? We also discussed about how they have other perspectives, and sometimes these are perspectives. I think as researchers, we may think that something can be a bad outcome, but it's not always a bad outcome. An example that someone shared was the research around falls. We associate with falls being a bad outcome, but a patient may say that if you're not falling, you're not challenging yourself. So we discussed about there should be a strengths-based approach. What have patient partners learned going through their experiences? We talked about the way that the system is built, where it seems to be geared towards finding these negative approaches. So considering the language, even thinking about funding, for example, you have to identify a problem and then justify why it's a problem. But then thinking of patients, is it relevant to the patients? And sometimes we discussed around establishing the scope, where patient partners, especially when it comes to data analysis, they may have a different perspectives. How nimble and flexible are we to go back to the research question to revise things? And that's where we discussed that it's really important to involve patient partners earlier on so that there's this iterative process to make changes along the way. Yeah, so that was the summary of what I took away anyway. There was a lot, I know, within our discussion. Lorraine, did you want to chime in?
Well, I think I actually want to come back to some discussion that was happening in the chat just before we went into our breakout rooms, because I think it relates to what you've identified. Francine, you had made a comment about that, and again, I'm doing a little bit of interpretation, so feel free to jump in and correct me, but that, you know, as a researcher, it's difficult to navigate the spaces around looking at some of these systemic barriers. So, you know, is there a role or someone that could do that in terms of looking at how we would influence the systems that are set up perhaps sometimes to act as barriers to patients? The example we gave before the break was around gaining access to data, but we're also talking about how we involve patients early in the process so that when we determine perhaps that our focus is not accurate, how does that get positioned back to a system that is designed to look at the problem? So, you know, there's some skills and spaces that researchers wouldn't naturally be navigating. So how does that, you know, how do we identify resources that are going to assist with that? And Francine, I don't know, not to put you on the spot, but if you wanted to expand on that or others in terms of this concept.
Sorry, reaching for my unmute. No, I think you touched on it perfectly.
All right, well, thank you so much to Group 3. Quickly check in with Lena and Alan. Anything you want to add to that?
Similar to what Linda and Lorraine shared in their group, one topic discussion was really that was brought up was really to really look at the complementary skill sets that the patient and or community-based partners can really bring to the table in terms of their roles in data analysis. So I think Alicia was saying to really get to know, have a lot of open conversations with the partners and uncover what they can bring to the table, I guess. What was interesting too is that along with that is that I think it was Isabel who was talking about that sometimes there could be a tension though, however, in the group of researchers with the patient partners, that there's this emphasis or we look too closely at the credentials we have, and that regardless of the credentials that even the researchers have, if they're PhDs or postdocs or whatever backgrounds they have, and credentials that some patient partners may have, she did mention that sometimes you could have the most rich or contributions from those who don't necessarily have a high or formal degree or of an education, but they have very deep experiences or deep perspectives with regard to their lived experiences in terms of contributing to the data analysis, or in general to the whole all aspects of the research project. And Francine mentioned as well that perhaps their role is to help the team or help the research team stay on track on keeping the perspective based on because the outcome is to help other patient partners, other community members as well. So their role could just be to recenter and to refocus it back to the main objective of the project and of the study. I'm just looking over my notes, but if anyone from group 2, if Alan too, would you like to oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to mention also Maritza shared her experience that she was started as a patient partner and is a research coordinator now. And then she shared her experience of how much she learned over the few years from becoming a research partner and to now being a coordinator, and the skills she gained throughout that time. If anyone wants to add in, I'm just my notes are a little bit scattered, so and I'm interpreting too as well. So if anyone wants to add to that too, but it's a very nice discussion.
Yeah, I think you covered it really well. But yeah, and we can just also emphasize, for the researchers in the group, the credentials don't so much matter when we're having these discussions about research design or data analysis. What was really emphasized a number of times in our breakout room, in our breakout session, was just centering on the research question, centering on the lived experience, and letting that inform the discussion. Yes, it is nice to be able to identify any type of complementary skill sets that could be contributed. I think we certainly acknowledge that, but just keeping a real central focus on the research question so that people can contribute sort of in any way.
There was also interesting comment that was made around scope. Darcy, I'm going to call on you to expand on that if you don't mind.
Yeah, I just feel that sometimes, and I'll be blunt about it, I think we use scope as an excuse not to go in a certain direction. I think that we need to develop our scope as we work through the process, and we need to make sure that once we get the input, let's analyze it and see where we're going with this, because we want scientific evidence is what we're looking for, and the science is, you don't know what the result's going to be when you start. So why do you establish the scope before you even get going, is what my point was.
And I think that speaks to involving patient partners very early in the process.
Right.
And this concept of it being iterative, right? And that willingness to reconsider the focus.
And I think that topic or that idea will certainly feed into the next breakout sessions. Hopefully that can be unpacked a bit more. Thanks, group 2. Thank you, Lena and Alan. So that leaves us, Kent. So briefly from group 1, was there any quick thoughts you wanted to add?
I was hoping somebody from our group 1 would speak up, because I feel like I've spent a lot of time talking. So others who were in group 1, do you have thoughts or reflections to share with our masses?
I can take a look at my notes and see if that jogs anyone's memory.
Group 1 has fallen quiet on us.
No, we were too chatty. That's why. Yeah, no. Our discussion, I think, took a rather interesting direction. There was the whole idea of patient partner involvement in qualitative versus quantitative analysis. Is personal bias really a problem when you are actively analyzing or collecting data? Is it any different if it's a patient partner versus a researcher doing it? So I think those were some key elements that were discussed. But I think one of the fundamental elements we took away from our chat was this idea of not really having any definitive clarity on the defined and delineated roles of both the patient partner and the researcher. So it can be a bit tough to distinguish what those complementary aspects of this relationship would look like. Because again, as some of the other groups explored, it takes time, it takes resources, it takes training, and it can be hard to sort of define, at what level you need your team to be on to then kind of move things forward. Anything else you want to add, Kent?
I think that's a reasonably good, reasonably good summary. I like the idea of the breaking down of hierarchy, and just the idea of being a complementary set of checks and balances for each other from a benevolent perspective rather than a competitive or hierarchical perspective.
All right, so with that, we will meander into our last broad discussion topic today. And I think we've sort of started to touch on what this would look like. And the question essentially states, how can researchers and patient partners anticipate, or I guess deal with the time as well as evolve patient partners in the process, but how can we better set clear expectations for those roles, so that you're not losing the interest of your partners, or they don't feel like they're being left to the wayside when there is really no interaction with your core group during that element of research. So open the rooms again, and similar to the last round, we'll do 15 minutes and come back. There we go. Can you record again? All right, perfect. So I realize we're coming up at the end of our time, so perhaps our debriefs would have to be slightly truncated. So just quickly, I think we'll give about 30 seconds to each of the rooms to report back, and then we'll wrap things up. So how about we start with Linda and Lorraine for their thoughts.
Sure. I can give a very quick summary to account for the iterative process and time. We discussed about how transparency and communication is really important. One of the groups, two of the members shared how they're part of a project that has a process guide about the whole research project, such as rough timelines, interview guide, training drive. So that's helpful to be transparent about a rough ballpark of what the commitment might look like, such as we anticipate the project will be a year, could be up to 2 years. It's okay, you can only commit for this amount of time. being able to communicate. We talked about how patients are committed. Most of them are committed to making positive changes. So most likely to be flexible. This is all about opportunities for capacity building. We talked about sometimes costs associated, but then from a systems level approach, sometimes you have more of the upfront costs, but then it's a return of investment with better outcomes with engaging with patient partners. We start to delve a little bit into the language about lived experiences and how you don't remove that away of lived experiences. You're always wearing that lens, but then we got cut off with short on time.
Well, thank you, Linda. Any quick thoughts?
Similar to the concepts of open communication from the beginning and being transparent, and also space with the patient partners, just to keep of the project. And also, I think it was Carrie who shared that, when in the data analysis phase specifically is to do a step-by-step process, having several meetings to get the whole group familiarized with the data, giving them the opportunity to digest it, and then revisiting back and then asking the questions on how to start and analyzing the data as well. And Francine also mentioned in terms of keeping open transparency in terms of interpretation of the data. This is what would be expected in academia and research journals versus how can we make this accessible information to the community as a whole, and having them help out in terms of the representation. I think Alan asked a great question about that in terms of the patient and the patient partners' involvement for that piece. If anyone wants to add as well, I'm pretty sure I may have missed some points there.
Perfect. Thank you, Lena. And Ken, super to chime in, but in a similar vein, that's pretty much where our group ended up as well. So the gist of it really is that it comes down to being transparent, setting those clear expectations, and really building that relationship, so that you can set the stage for that productive collaboration and interaction. And yeah, similar to what Linda's group was touching on in terms of some practical applications or practical elements that you can incorporate. Some of the elements that were brought up on our discussion is just keeping that communication channels open. So in what ways can the research team be more interactive with patient partners, especially in those phases of the project where interaction or engagement typically falls off. So we had talked about newsletters and that type of thing. So anything else you wanted to add, Kent, or that? I think that was pretty much it, the gist.
I think that was, again, a pretty good summary. Again, just that idea, like Lena's group was saying about maintaining the cohesion with the research team members, closing the loop, as we like to say. And then something else that Francine has just entered into the chat here that I didn't want to be missed in our closing time together is just building on John's comment about having the confidence to ask a stupid question. You never know who else in the room has the same question, but is too scared to ask. And I would say, again, that applies potentially to all the team members. I think maybe the benefit that the patient partners have is that most of them can go in with the mindset that it's okay.
Thank you for joining us today during the session to discuss and explore this topic a bit more. Some great ideas were shared, some great perspectives were relayed, and I hope that you're able to take some of these away back to your own projects as you further consider how to more fully integrate the patient perspective throughout your project. That said, there were a few key learnings that I wanted to just highlight from the Cashman article that we had referenced in the introductory note of this session. And really, it would ultimately serve as a bit of a summary for some of those key themes that came up in the discussions. But again, hopefully it can set the stage for some further discussions within your team. First off, and I think crucially important, is acknowledging that engaging all partners in the data analysis or interpretation of findings within a research project is worth doing and is doable. And by doing so, most typically, you will be creating some experiential learning opportunities for your patient partners. And not only is that effective in more dutifully engaging your partners throughout the process. But by including the community, when it comes to analysis or interpretation, you certainly are increasing the authenticity and applicability of your findings, since the ultimate results will be more reflective of needs or priorities that are of greater importance to your particular population that you work with. And I think secondarily to that, in our group discussion came forward, is that it's really critical to anticipate the time that is required to involve patient partners in this capacity well, and to acknowledge that it is an iterative process with a lot of revisions, a lot of going back to the board to figure out what the next steps are, and especially when you are working with patient partners who may not have had a lot of previous experience being involved in research projects, it's vitally important to set expectations and be explicit that the process is iterative and will take a lot of time from the top, right from the beginning of your project, when you are developing your research plan and setting your research agenda. Not only by being transparent sort of from the start, and obtaining the commitment from your research partners or your patient partners, but by doing so from the beginning will help reduce analysis fatigue and the temptation of projects to take shortcuts. And what I mean by that is typically when it comes to the data analysis phase of a project, that's quite thrown out, and there's not much opportunity for engagement with your patient partners. So by setting that expectation clearly from the beginning, patients are aware of what the timeline is going to look like and what sort of engagement activities they can expect. And then my second point about not the shortcuts, really that just comes down to the idea of creating those opportunities and planning for those opportunities to engage with your patient partners, to solicit their input, and not foregoing those just to get the project wrapped up and paper published. And lastly, it's just this notion of researchers and patient partners exhibiting complementary roles and skills that synergistically, I guess, will increase the impact or applicability of the findings. And going back to the previous point of setting your plan in motion, it's really critical that the roles and responsibilities of both researchers and patient partners be established right at the beginning, and have been done so collaboratively through a lot of open dialogue and discussions, because that really will tease out sort of where your team is and where you can go. And of course, it goes without mentioning that there are times where it would be appropriate for researchers and patient partners to work collaboratively on either data analysis and or interpretation of findings. However, realistically, at other times or in other contexts, it would be dependent on the nature of the project, and researchers might bear the brunt of the data analysis work, and patient partners may only comment on the interpretation of those findings and provide feedback when it comes to mobilizing the work or mobilizing the findings of the work. And two elements that the paper mentions is that it's crucial to recognize that the patient partners' roles and any skills they bring to the project, specifically in relation to data analysis and data interpretation, can be heavily influenced by their prior experience in research activities. And similarly, as we mentioned before, researchers can greatly contribute to the experiential learning of patient partners by simplifying and presenting the data in a more easily digestible and understandable format, so that it can be interpreted and in the context of the lived experience of the partners you are working with. Thank you all for taking the time and really being interactive and involved in the discussions that we were having. We do have another session coming up in March, so stay tuned for more details. And of course, certainly want to invite your input on how the session went, and particular any suggestions you would have for enhancing it, or if there are any particular topics that you would like to see discussed in this fashion or explored in this way. Happy to fill out the form, and we will certainly take that into consideration when we launch our next series of our pods. So again, thank you so much for taking such a big chunk of your time out of your day to join us and add your experience and expertise to the discussion. It was really enlightening, and I'm hoping you all got as much out of it as I did. And we will see you again soon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, your week, and your upcoming weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.